If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on The More Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new weekly television and radio shows.
The comments and views expressed on The More Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kevin Moore, The More Show, or this radio station and its affiliates or sponsors.
Hello and welcome to another edition of The More Show, which is sponsored by the UFO Matrix magazine. On today's show, I'm about to be joined with my guest, Loren Coleman. Now, Loren is one of the world's leading cryptozoologists. He is an honorary member of the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club. He started his fieldwork and investigations in the 1960s after travelling and trekking extensively in pursuit of cryptozoology mysteries, and began writing to share his experiences. Loren has been investigating cryptozoology evidence and folklore since the Abominable Snowman caught his interest over 4 decades ago, leading him to research mystery Black Panther sightings and the reports of napes, North American apes, in the American Midwest. He has travelled to every state in the USA, throughout Canada, Mexico, Scotland and the Virgin Islands, interviewing witnesses of lake monsters, Bigfoots, giant snakes, Mothman sightings, Thunderbirds and more. Loren Coleman, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
It's great. It's great being here. Even though it's cold outside, it's warm inside.
Now, Loren, where in the United States are you based?
I'm based in Portland, Maine, which is the furthest north state other than Alaska. So, for instance, today it's 4 degrees outside.
Okay, now you specialize in cryptozoology. Now, just for our guests out there, what is cryptozoology?
Yes, I've been involved in cryptozoology since 1960, and cryptozoology, of course, is the study of unknown or hidden or yet to be discovered animals. A lot of people make the mistake thinking that these creatures are mythical. They're actually folkloric and legendary. They're based upon reality, whereas mythical creatures are fantasy, like, for instance, unicorns, whereas I pursue the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot or Yeti, which are really based upon native or local legends.
Okay, well, let's just talk about some of these local legends. Let's talk about Bigfoot. Have you ever seen a Bigfoot?
No, I have not seen a Bigfoot. I've been to every state in the United States except for Alaska, interviewing eyewitnesses. I found some tracks in different Midwestern sites. I've seen how they disturb areas. I've seen where they've been, and I've gone on reconstructions or recreations of eyewitness accounts. But Bigfoot, in essence, worldwide there are hairy upright creatures that are seen, and most people are from the 1920s through the 1960s. There was a lot of media attention to the Abominable Snowman of the Himalayas, and the Daily Mail did their expedition in 1954, and Sir Edmund Hillary did his expedition in 1960, and the Abominable Snowman of the Himalayas of Nepal and Bhutan and Tibet really is much more of a rock ape type of creature. It goes down on all fours. It has more of an orangutan sort of sense to it. Whereas the Bigfoot, and before there was use of the word Bigfoot in 1958, there was they were called Sasquatch up in Canada. And these are much more upright. The footprint of the Bigfoot Sasquatch looks like a human footprint, except about 16 to 18 inches long. And so they're 6 feet to 8 feet tall, and totally much more bipedal. There are not that many reports of them going down on all fours, and they seem in many ways to be like a human-like creature, except they're covered with hair, and they don't have culture, they don't have speech, and so that's why we still figure that they're probably part of the more ape-like creatures versus human-like creatures.
Okay, well, if Bigfoot does exist, then where did he come from?
Well, the theory is that if you look at the fossil record, there are ape-like creatures, Australopithecine, Paranthropus, that really existed in Africa, came out of Africa, went across Asia. Some of the reports of both the fossil candidates like Megaanthropus in Java and in Indonesia, where it's called the giant man of Java, and really some of the larger specimens of Homo erectus seem to show the footprints through Asia. And then you have, of course, still today there, in China, the Yeren, which is not like a Yeti, but is much more like the Bigfoot, come across the Bering Strait through the coastal areas of Alaska down through Canada and then into the Pacific Northwest. So the main habitats and the main reports that we have of Bigfoot-type creatures are in China with the Yeren, through Alaska and British Columbia down into Northern California of Bigfoot Sasquatch. And then if you also look in the Andes, you have a thing down there called the UC, which is a UCU, and that very much reflects a Bigfoot-type creature, upright, a footprint that looks like a human, and not ape-like, more human-like, but hairy. So you have this continuous band through the mountainous areas of the Pacific Rim of these Bigfoot-type creatures, and really coming from the Pleistocene, coming from 40,000, 1 million to 40,000 years ago into modern history.
And is Bigfoot just indigenous to America?
Well, I think that what the confusion is of course regional names, and that's why you have something that's very similar to it in China and in the Andes, but from Canada and Alaska and the United States, you do have the Bigfoot Sasquatch kind of creatures, but I think what we're saying is that there are some similar ones in Asia and South America. It's just that the confusion is when people then try to add every hairy creature that's seen in the Mideast, Persia, or Africa, or even the Himalayas. Those are really something that's very different. I mean, the little creatures that are hairy that we have reports from Africa seem to be much more like Australopithecine and really not at all like Bigfoot. And, of course, they have different regional names, but Bigfoot's very much different, and I think that the reason that we know so much about them is because the Native Canadians, the Native Americans, the Eskimos, the Inuits have had tales about these for 300 to 500 years, and so when the Europeans, European Americans, started colonizing some of these areas, the native peoples were already very familiar with them, and then loaned some of the stories. So it was only in 1958 when a newspaper man in California came up with the word Bigfoot that we really have the modern era of Bigfoot. But they were here before then, of course.
And what do you think about Bigfoot's representation in the movies? For example, Bigfoot and the Hendersons. I mean, is that a fair representation?
I think, and I have done, quite a bit about this. I taught a documentary film course for 13 years at the university, and I would show the progression of Bigfoot through the movies, because what you have in terms of the early depictions of Bigfoot in some of the films around, from 1960s, 1970s, were very, very closely matching what people were seeing in the field. The Patterson-Gimlin film, which is the footage of the Bigfoot-type creature at Bluff Creek, that really supposedly depicts a real Bigfoot. And so most of the filmmakers really were showing a creature that was completely covered with hair, very short hair, not much more than 3 or 4 inches long, and having the same color all over. But then what, of course, happened was Hollywood discovered Bigfoot, and so in 1987, when you had Harry and the Hendersons, very much a comedy film, it showed a Bigfoot that was much bigger than 6.5 feet tall, and it also showed a Bigfoot with longer head hair, with a kind of a blonde beard that made it with a blank face. That then has come into through the popular culture. Some of the artists now depict Bigfoot looking more like a man with a beard, and that really doesn't match up with what people are still seeing in the field, which matches more what was seen by Patterson's film with the overall same color in the brownish fur and not having the beard and different things like that. So you have this great gap between what Hollywood and popular culture is showing for Bigfoot versus what people are really still seeing.
Sure. And the 1967 Patterson video that's available for people to watch on YouTube, and there's a link on the site for it as well. Just tell me about the controversy that surrounds that video, and also, can they recreate that kind of video today?
Well, actually, they cannot, and which is one of the saving graces of why many of us really still have some trust in that film. Here you have a situation where two individuals, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, they were very conscious of how popular Bigfoot was becoming, so they wanted to make a film about the hunt for Bigfoot. So they'd rented a camera, they went to this northern area of California around Bluff Creek, where the first footprints had been found in 1958, and there had actually been some recent sightings there. So they were rounding the bend of a creek bed, and all of a sudden one of the horses riled up, and Roger Patterson got from his horse. He quickly grabbed his camera because he saw in front of him was this Bigfoot slowly walking away, grabbed the camera, took the picture of the Bigfoot, then got it back and got it developed and then showed it to different scientists at British Columbia. Now, what happened between 1997 and the year 2000, three different, really they were producers from Hollywood, producers from Fox TV, and some skeptics came out with three different theories saying that they knew who was in the Bigfoot suit. One guy was named Romney, another guy was named Hieronymus, and what was so laughable when I started interviewing all of these skeptics and debunkers is they all had their own personal theory, and yet none of them could recreate the film. The BBC, National Geographic came in with documentary film teams, Fox News came in. None of them could recreate the Patterson film that was actually using 1967 technology. And they were using technology that had progressed 30 years, and the film has not been able to be faked again. So the people that they're showing that are in the film are, 50-year-old men that have a pot belly and look like the Bigfoot. But one of the amazing things, of course, about the Patterson film is that this is a female in which you can definitely see breasts upon the Bigfoot, which, knowing all of the gorilla suits and all of the Hollywood fakery that was made back then, none of them had female Bigfoot or gorilla suits. They were all males. That was the general model for any kind of costume. So for people to think that faking could have happened so easily, it's kind of undeniable that there's something much more extraordinary going on.
Okay, so we do have female and male Bigfoots.
This whole idea that there's one Bigfoot or one Nessie or one Abominable Snowman, that's very much not the way cryptozoologists think. There's breeding populations of these animals. They just haven't been discovered, and yet everybody often talks about the Bigfoot or the Abominable Snowman. But obviously family groups have been seen, a male, a female, the whole picture there.
So, how many Bigfoots are out there, would you say?
Dr. Grover Krantz in Washington State, when he was estimating the number of Bigfoot that would be needed out there, he felt that the reports were showing that there were between 2,000 and 4,000 Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. And it's also been written that for every one Bigfoot seen, there's probably 10 other reports where we're not hearing about them. The other thing that we think that there's probably one Bigfoot for every 10,000 bears that are out there. The population of Bigfoot is very small. And we know right now, for instance, the number of mountain gorilla in eastern Africa to just maintain that breeding population there is only about 350 to 500 mountain gorillas. So we know that some of these populations can dip to very, very low numbers.
I mean, how do you argue, Loren, that these mysterious creatures aren't just part of our imagination? I mean, where's the science stance on this?
Well, I would never argue that they're part of our imagination. That's what the skeptics would say. I would say, as opposed to that what we know, I've gone around all of North America, and one of the questions I always ask wildlife biologists is, how many times have you found a dead bear or a dead mountain lion in the woods? And the answer always is no. They never find those kinds of animals. So one of the skeptical questions that I'm always asked is, why don't we find the body of a Bigfoot? Well, first of all, their numbers are very low. They have human-like characteristics, so they may have, cooperation, which the body is hid. Large predator animals, large omnivores, hide their bodies when they die anyway. So I'm not surprised. I don't need to have some kind of imaginary, escape clause like, the Bigfoot are disappearing into UFOs, or they're eating their dead, or some of the answers that I find completely ridiculous. All we have to do is look at the modern world, and a bear dying in the woods disappears within 2 days. Crows and vultures and then rodents eat all of the creatures, and then, maggots and everything else, and then porcupines come along to eat the larger bones. So the natural environment takes care of its own as far as hiding and destroying and recycling bodies. So I'm not at all surprised we haven't found Bigfoot. And the other thing is, if we only have to look back 100 years, there were reports of a Bigfoot-like creature in Africa, and we today know that as the mountain gorilla. The fantastic reports that were coming out of Africa was of this Bigfoot-type creature that went around and squeezed to death native women, and then of course we now know that the Bigfoot over there, which is the mountain gorilla, is a very peaceful creature. It's just that it took over 60 years for them to kill the first one and prove that they existed.
So, Loren, what is the most compelling story that you've had to research over Bigfoot?
Well, I think that if you look at Bigfoot, you have to take the real overall body of the evidence, and there is no more compelling incident than the Patterson-Gimlin film, because here you have an area that there's folklore, so you have Indian legends, you have eyewitness sighting, you have an animal reaction, you have the eyewitnesses saying that they smelled the creature, you have the creature on film, and then the creature left footprints, so you have a trackway of 10 rather intriguing footprints that show that the foot actually moved and was not a fake, a cutout of a piece of wood that somebody had pressed. There's all the 10 footprints are all different, so the foot was a mobile, viable foot. So I really think the whole interaction and overlap and kind of conjunction of the Patterson-Gimlin film, all of the things that went into that, is by far the best piece of evidence that we have that there's that we should really keep researching and pursuing the Bigfoot creatures, because I just don't see them as a hoax. The rumors that John Chambers had made the suits from the Planet of the Apes just was one of the early debunkings, and we know that John Chambers said that he left that rumor out there because he thought it helped his reputation. But all of the suits that were made for Planet of the Apes was from only the chest up, so they don't even match. And so those kinds of early debunkings, the recent ones in the 90s, just hold no water. And the Patterson film shows muscle movement under the hair. It shows herniations in the skin, fur of this creature. It shows the glinting of the eyes. It shows mammillary glands that just you don't find on fake costumes. So overall, I'd say the best case is Patterson-Gimlin film.
And is there any evidence out there of footprints or hair?
Oh, sure. There's fecal material. There's thousands of trackways that have been found. One incident in Washington State, they found over 1,000 footprints. You've got hair samples that match nothing right now, and that actually is very good because until we have a type specimen of the Sasquatch Bigfoot, all of these hair samples that keep coming back near human but not human, not gorilla, not Homo sapiens, all really are exactly what we would expect, because until you find the DNA and the right hair from a Bigfoot that's been captured or killed, all of the reactions and tests are going to come back inconclusive.
And has anybody ever tried to communicate with these creatures telepathically?
Well, I think you're always going to get fantasies of psychic Bigfoot and different things like that. And, of course, all you have to do is talk to anyone that tends to believe in telepathy, and they feel that they're picking up thoughts of dogs, let alone Bigfoot. And so I'm finding that is just a whole different subject that's really not at all connected to zoology.
And is there any museums which we can go and see the Bigfoot at all?
Well, there's all kinds of different museums around the country, especially with regard to Bigfoot. You have up into the University of British Columbia, they've had different rotating exhibits of Bigfoot. Near south of San Francisco and the Monterey area, there's been a Bigfoot museum there. There's a Bigfoot Discovery Museum. Portland, Maine, my museum, which is the International Cryptozoology Museum, has 200 casts, 8-foot-tall Bigfoot model, and lots of different exhibits connected to Bigfoot. So you go around. They're really, some of them are more tourist attractions. Some of there's probably 2 or 3 really good museums around the country where you can examine serious exhibits.
Okay, Loren, well, just moving on subjects now. Let's now talk about the Mothman. So what got you interested in the Mothman?
Well, of course, since I've been interested in cryptozoology since 1960, one of the major incidents that occurred was in 1966 and 67 out of West Virginia. We had all of these reports of giant bird-like creatures, which locally were called Mothman. So I was involved in investigating the cases in the 60s, and then what occurred, I was writing a book in the year 2000. I began writing a book about Mothman. I had done different chapters and different articles down through the years, and I thought with the turn of the century that I'd put together a whole book on the Mothman and look at it. And then what occurred was Sony Screen Gems called me up early in the year 2000. They said, "We understand that you might be working on a book on Mothman. Do you think you could speed it up because we're going to make a movie about it?" And so I said, "Sure." We're trying to get it published this year. So the publisher and I rushed out a book that was published at the same time when the Mothman Prophecies came out. In January of 2002, this new movie came out starring Richard Gere, and it was very much based upon my friend John Keel's book, which he'd written in 1975, looking at how the Mothman, a creature that was about 6 feet tall, had large glowing red eyes and large bat-like wings or bird-like wings, had been reported in the Point Pleasant, West Virginia year. And the whole idea of the title of the book, The Mothman Prophecies, really referred to what many people at the time thought was the sightings of Mothman being a banshee-like occurrence, because at the end of the 13 months of the sightings, the Point Pleasant Silver Bridge collapsed and 46 people were killed. So the whole, kind of European and English legends of the Banshee really got transferred over to America with the Mothman, because people felt that that was some kind of precursor for disaster, and the movie really very much picked up on that. And so my book coming out, and I really served and helped the movie get publicity by doing something in the range of 400 radio interviews around the world to help them promote the movie, and then I could talk about my book, which was called Mothman and Other Curious Encounters.
So, with the John Keel book, was the Mothman movie aligned with John Keel's book? Was the movie sort of Hollywood vamped up?
Well, Kevin, I believe I'd have to say all of the above, because what occurred with John Keel's book, of course, was they took the premise of the Mothman, they took the basic stories of the sightings and John going down there and investigating and the bridge collapsing, but what they did, of course, is they Hollywoodized it, because they brought it up to contemporary time. They much more linked. There was a character that was reported around the same time, but not at the same time, called Indira Cold, which was a entity, alien-like thing that was seen in not near there, but in West Virginia, and the movie really meshed that into the voice of Indira Cold and the sightings of Indira Cold being the personification of Mothman as a entity, and that never happened that way. And a lot of the things that happened in the movie only happened in the mind of some people. They did other things, like there were 46 people killed when the bridge collapsed in 1967, and they act like the bridge happened more recently, and they only said 36 people died from the collapse of the bridge. So the movie very much, and I was involved with the studio on some of this. Actually, the Mark Pellington, who was the director, because he was quite upset to see that the Men in Black movie had come out only a couple years before that, took all of the UFOs and Men in Black references in the Mothman story that Keel had in his book. He took them out of the movie and really made it just about a much more a psychological thriller.
So there was Men in Black visits to Point Pleasant. Is that what we're saying?
That's what Keel thought. I mean, I think what we found happening is Keel very much never saw himself as a ufologist. In my interviews with him for the book, he very much said he was a demonologist. So if anything, if there were psychics involved, if there were UFOs involved, if there were Men in Black involved, even though they had absolutely no connection to Mothman, because they were happening near Point Pleasant, even if it was 5 months later, Keel put them in the book as all kind of, and then he put a mixer on. He really stirred it into a vortex storytelling, which he made them all overlap, even though they weren't overlapping stories.
So are we saying that there was an entity appearing when the Mothman was around in Point Pleasant?
No, there wasn't, and that it was in the movie, but it wasn't in the reality. There was actually, and what it turns out, a lot of the UFO people quite clearly know that this Warren Dellenberg, who reported the Indira Cold, he would make up stories, and there probably was absolutely no foundation to some of those sightings and some of those alien contacts. It was really by a man who was trying to con people into giving him money for some of his UFO contactee stories. That's one of the unfortunate things about the Mothman story, is that it really contains many elements that are fakery.
So where did the name Mothman come from?
The Mothman name came from a copy editor on an Ohio newspaper. He was a fan of the Batman series on TV, and he decided he didn't like, because what people were saying they were seeing was a giant bird and a large bird. He didn't like that, so he wanted to make a headline that had much more appeal to him, so he came up with the Mothman name. Well, Mothman was not called a Mothman by the eyewitnesses, and in the movie, this whole notion that the they look like a moth or that it had wings like a moth is just totally patently untrue. And that's why I, in a lot of the writings I've done, and a lot of other cryptozoologists have pointed out, that the Mothman stories really have much more in common with the giant Thunderbird stories of the Native Americans. Mothman is a local regional name, but if you look at the old stories from that area, here we have Appalachia, and in that area of Appalachia you had over 100 years of reports of giant birds. And it's just in 66, you have the Mothman name being tied to these incidental reports. I mean, there was certainly a concentration. Over 100 witnesses saw this creature, so we know that it was there. We know that it was real. We just don't, of course, know exactly what it was.
And this creature was around Point Pleasant between 66 and 67?
Yes. Although, as I just pointed out, over 100 years ago, a giant owl-like creature, a bird-like creature, chased people in their horse and carriages, and then 50 years after that, there were reports of giant birds chasing people in their jalopies, in their old cars. You know, these waves of different giant bird reports had been in the Point Pleasant area for over 100 years.
Now, people have begun to speculate that the Mothman had direct knowledge that the bridge in Point Pleasant was going to collapse on December the 15th, 1967, and that direct interaction had occurred between the citizens of Point Pleasant and the Mothman. Was this the case?
No direct interaction. Different people would report that they would have dreams of in which they would see Christmas packages floating in the river. And that was a prominent dream that Mary Hyde, who was one of the local editors and newspaper women and a good friend of John Keel, she would have that dream. And as it turns out, of course, because there were so many cars stuck on the bridge and then so many cars went into the water and it was Christmas time, there were no doubt, people did say that they saw packages in the river, Christmas packages already, wrapped up. So those dreams did come true. As far as interactions between the beast itself, the Mothman creature, other than it flying and chasing people or scaring the bejeevers out of individuals, the real connection to it being a banshee and a polka, as you have over in England, the legends of black dogs and a banshee-type creatures coming before the death of people or disasters. That really was a thought that was given to the stories after the fact, after they happened. Then people started making the connection.
Now, after the Mothman movie was released in 2002, there were some unexplained deaths that occurred during filming and obviously after filming. What can you tell us about this?
Well, what I started noticing after the movie was released, that I started picking up on relatives of different individuals were dying. For instance, the week that the movie opened in Mason County, which is where Point Pleasant is, they had the most traffic accident fatalities in the history of that area. Something like 21 different people died on the rural roads down there. The city of Point Pleasant lost the power to the city. You had two different eyewitnesses that are mentioned in the movie, that their characters are based upon them, that they actually had brothers and sisters die. And so I started doing putting together what I called the Mothman Cursed Death List. And within quite easily, I was able to put together 84 different names of people. For instance, the director's wife, who was only 42 years old, died mysteriously. The special effects director died. The executive producer of the movie died. And so besides the individuals that are closely connected to eyewitnesses of the Mothman, you started noticing And I certainly started noticing that different individuals with connected to the cinema part of the Mothman were also dying in great numbers. And I mean, I really tracked it all the way up until Alan Bates, who was in the movie, died too. And I mean, he was an older man, and that was not unexpected. But there was some people that were very young. One of my book cover was put together by an artist in Arkansas, and his son committed suicide. So it became very spooky, the sort of the connections to the Mothman curse.
Did the Mothman prophesize the collapse of the bridge? I mean, did he ever talk to anyone?
Yeah, there was no... the Mothman never talked to anybody, never left messages. The Mothman was just a creature that was seen, and it was really a reconstruction of the events by Keel, and if even he did not come up with the title, The Mothman Prophecy. That was the publisher that came up with that. So the whole notion that there was this banshee effect or that there was a prophecy really was something that people... I mean, the Mothman incidents happened in 67, 66, 67, the collapse of the bridge in 7. Keel wrote different articles in UFO magazines, and in his book, Strange Creatures from Time and Space, that came out in 78, and in 75 was his Mothman Prophecies book. So you don't really have a good connection here with anything being presented beforehand, showing that people were saying, oh, something bad is going to happen, and then it happening with the bridge. That is just something with the dreams that people felt. They almost felt a foreboding, but they didn't have any connection to the Mothman. They just felt that the whole Mothman and what was happening up and down the Ohio Valley, concurrently but not connected to it, was the UFO sightings. For instance, Mothman would be seen in April, and then you wouldn't have UFO sightings until November, and so that was happening over and over again. But there wasn't even that connection for people between the Mothman and the UFO and the bridge collapse until 5, 6, 7 years later.
Okay, so there was UFO sightings around Point Pleasant.
Oh, definitely. And Keel, why he showed up in Point Pleasant, he was investigating reports of winged cats. Sometimes there are these strange cats, domestic cats, or I guess you call them Mahdi's over there or something. They have wings on them, some kind of birth defect. So Keel had been in the area investigating whether there were some strange births of some domestic cats that had wings on them. And then because he had been a writer of UFO stories, nonfiction newspaper reports of UFOs, he also started noticing there were UFO reports. And then he found out about the large bird, the big bird reports, had been calling his friend Ivan Sanderson in New York and saying, have you heard about any large bird reports in the Point Pleasant area? And then that's when the editor, the copy editor over in Ohio, came up with this name Mothman, and then Keel started writing articles about Mothman and the UFOs in that area.
Okay, so once the bridge had collapsed, was the Mothman ever sighted in the same vicinity again?
Well, he had the Mothman-type reports, of course, covered those 13 months, and people had seen them throughout those 13 months. And then what happened, I've been to Point Pleasant a couple times since then investigating, and people quite, in a scared sort of fashion and confidentially said to me, none of the newspapers around here are reporting it, but we're still seeing Mothmen after the bridge collapsed. That's just foolishness to think that the Mothman went away. The Mothmen were still around here. There were Bigfoot that were still around here. There were cattle mutilations. The whole area was filled. It was almost, and that's why you get some of the conspiracy theories in which people were saying that it was a CIA experiment, that somebody had put LSD into the drinking water, and that all the residents in the area were just having massive hallucinations of all kinds of things. Because indeed, Keel's a very good investigator. He went in there, and people would open up to him, and so what became quite obvious is that all kinds of different anomalous and paranormal phenomena was being seen in that area. And I have had the same experience because my interviewing style is very non-confrontive, and people end up trusting some of us investigators, and they tell us quite clearly that there's all kinds of strange things that are going on in that area. It's a very bizarre part of West Virginia. You know, you get all kinds of different strange sightings from there.
Now, John Keel, the original researcher, are you still in contact with him, Loren?
Yes, although, he's gone off of email for a couple years, but I once in a while write him letters or, have phone conversations. But he, like I mentioned earlier, his health is declining, so he's just not keeping in touch with the one or two people that help him out locally, and then I hear about him through those folks because he really doesn't like to be bothered with even researchers, let alone fans these days. But then once out of the blue moon, he'll show up for the... after the movie came out, the city of Point Pleasant decided that they could make money, and they have now an annual Mothman Festival. And I think that's really good because that's a really economically depressed area. So I suggested to them that they get a museum, they get a festival together, and they really did that, sort of like what Roswell does now. Keel once in a while shows up to give a talk. And so over the last few years, Keel has actually gone down to Point Pleasant and appeared to talk. Because as I write up in my book, what's really strange is that the Science Fiction Channel was doing a documentary about the movie, and they were getting ready to film John Keel for, in 2001, they were going to fly him down to Point Pleasant to do an interview. And unfortunately, the day that they'd picked to fly John Keel down to Point Pleasant was 9/11. So that was the day that it hit the Twin Towers in New York City, and so Keel never made that flight. And in fact, he feels very thankful that he didn't because he doesn't know what would happen to him, on 9/11. So anyway, eventually, what happened with Science Fiction Channel? I flew into New York City in October after 9/11, and John Keel and I appeared in a documentary about the Mothman Prophecies movie.
And has anybody ever described what the face of the Mothman looks like?
No, what really would take people's breath away and get their attention, of course, was all they really could see was these two quite glowing, reflective, and never was, the red never came from the creatures themselves in the eyes. It came from the reflection of headlights from automobiles. And so nobody ever saw the face. They only would describe these huge, giant red eyes that almost look like those reflectors that you have at the end of a driveway, the big red reflectors. So nobody really says or can describe what the Mothman's face looks like. They only can describe the giant red eyes.
And has the Mothman been reported in any other countries, any other regions recently?
Well, you get, Alaska had, which is, of course, the United States, but Alaska had reports of giant thunderbird-like creatures. There's, of course, creatures like the rock in old legends that are like the giant thunderbirds. But in general, what we have to be very cautious of is in the Mothman Prophecies, there were two fictitious reports of Mothman being seen at Chernobyl and Mothman being seen at Mexico City before the Mexico City earthquake and before Chernobyl, before the meltdown. Both of those reports that were inserted into the Mothman movie were fictional. They never happened in reality. And so every time I hear about quote-unquote Mothman being seen in another culture, every story that I've run down has been a fake, been a fiction, been a novelization of the Mothman Prophecy story put into somebody's folklore. And so that's what's turned out, and I'm sad to say that, Mothman really seems to be a part of the folklore and legend of North America, and really is not connected to any other country.
So are we saying that the Mothman is equal to what you might class as a big bird?
Yes, definitely. And so when you start looking at other cultures and you use that label, is there big bird reports? Yes, we have some very good reports from the Alps, for instance, from old European reports of giant eagles, of giant birds that are way beyond what we know are, realistic from known species. South Africa has had these giant bird reports. In Asia you get some of the giant bird reports, but them being connected to a banshee and having red glowing eyes and being a Mothman are not truthful. They're not really what's going on there. But you do have the big bird reports from around the world.
So what's the difference then between a big bird and a thunderbird, Loren?
A thunderbird is merely a very specific name given by North American, Native American tribes for their folkloric creature. Supposedly the word thunderbird comes because, a couple things are going on with the name. A lot of Caucasians who hear that word think that the Native Americans are saying that, your big birds are making making the noise that is creating the thunder. And so that's the misunderstanding that's come about by Euro-Americans and Caucasians. But what we now know is that the Thunderbird name really comes from the fact that the native peoples have known that the thermal waves and the thunderstorms are really one of the major ways that these large birds have traveled. And if you look back, we know that the teratorns, which were a giant condor-like bird during the Pleistocene, during the Ice Age, which was known to the native peoples, and in fact, if you look at the La Brea tar pit, you find both these teratorns, which were these giant birds, their fossil remains found in conjunction with humans. And among the Cherokee, they talk about these teratorns, these giant birds that would come down and eat and snatch their children off of the beaches and off of the different areas. So there's this overlap between the native peoples knowing that the thunderbirds were actually using the thunderstorms to hide their movements, and their migration would happen every spring and every fall of these giant birds going north and south in North America from the Bald Mountains, from the Rockies, from the Appalachians, from the Ozark Mountains is where you hear these giant bird reports. And the native peoples certainly knew that the interaction between the thunderstorms and how these giant birds were hiding behind the clouds and using some of the thermal updrafts from the heated plains to really bring these condors along to where they needed to migrate or they needed to hunt some of the game.
And how big were the wingspan of some of these creatures?
The wingspan, they were reports from 15 feet to 25 feet across. Some of the people up in Alaska who saw some of these creatures, in the early part of this century, in the 21st century, in 2003, 2004, were comparing these thunderbirds that they were seeing to the size of a Cessna plane. They were saying that these were rather giant birds. And so, the native peoples on the plains looking up in the sky were seeing these things that look like small aircraft. Also, that's why some of the, among the totem pole art that you find in the Pacific Northwest, one of the prominent features on the totem pole are Thunderbirds, and also the Thunderbirds that were taking small whales, or that were seen taking, small bison, small, buffalo from the plains. So, the young of the whales and the young of the bison were often being eaten and taken aloft by these Thunderbirds.
Just going back to the Mothman here, Loren, there's a question I think I've left out, which I want to get answered. Do you think the Mothman was a force of good or a force of evil?
Well, I think what's important is to really to look at the kind of split that happened. I think on a zoological basis, on a purely biological basis, there seems to have been a biological creature there, maybe an unknown species of giant owl or giant bird. But then something very special happened in terms of those reports. It's almost as if you had a psychological warfare occur, and not to blame it on John Keel, but the way that John Keel came into this, his investigations with almost a demonological point of view, one of the primary witnesses, whose name is, one of the first witnesses there who saw that, she would tell me that John Keel came and would interview her. And this poor woman, she said that by the end of her interview, she was scared to death, and within a few months, she had crucifixes, crosses, put on every wall of her home because she was afraid that the demon, the devil, was going to come into her home because of Mothman. And this poor woman, had a mental break. She had to go into a mental health hospital to really recover for a while because she had a total, what used to be called a nervous breakdown. And it's just a sad thing to see. And so I think with the Mothman death curse, with the kind of the banshee-like effects that have been given to Mothman, some of the reports of the men in black trying to abduct some people, that there's a whole psychological aspect to Mothman that really does have evil incarnate in it. And actually, I'm revising my book, and I've come up with the title of my new book is going to be Mothman Evil Incarnate, because I really see a whole dark reflection to what Mothman has become. Whereas it may have been an exciting new animal and a new species in the 1960s, what Mothman has become is really almost a reflection of the Dark Knight. The Batman, the Mothman, the darkest, deepest, evilest parts of these kinds of reports have come out through the stories of the Mothman. Something I wasn't expecting, and yet something I've certainly not turned away from and have documented. To have so many people die, to have so many people have such bad luck. I mean, as I was noticing towards the end of my 400 interviews on radio, I would have the worst luck on those. People were being interrupted. They would interrupt me. The phone would go dead. We'd get electronic interference in some of the interviews. I would get off the phone and go up to another room in my home, and a light bulb would burst above me. And it just, I never, other than absolutely never making any money from the book, I never had any bad luck personally having any injuries or anything. Or I did lose my mother, died during this, and a stepsister died who's much younger than me during all of this. But I personally never was injured, but I certainly noticed that all around me, the worst bad luck comes whenever you start talking about the moth. So, I can talk about Bigfoot for hours and I'll be on a 4-hour program, never be interrupted. I do a 15-minute or a half-an-hour interview about Mothman, and every technical that goes wrong can go wrong. And so there is something very strange and evil about Mothman, and so I'm very cautious when I get around that whole subject.
And what subject matter regarding cryptozoology do you find the most perplexing?
I think that's a hard question. I think one of my favorite cases is, of course, the Dover demon that happened in 1977, of this little orange creature that seemed to pop in to Dover, Massachusetts, over a 2-day spell, and just was seen by 4 different witnesses and popped out. I mean, it was a little golem-like creature that really is not connected to anything else known in cryptozoology or even in the UFO field. And yet, what I started noticing is in Dover, Arkansas, they had Black Panther reports that year. There were Dover kind of connections as far as a strange name game that started popping up all over the world in 1977. Those kinds of, they bring a smile to my face, and I don't know if they're connected to cryptozoology or just paranormal, anomalous, Fortean phenomena, but they certainly get my attention, let me say that.
And does the field of cryptozoology expand? I mean, are you always finding new animals?
Well, I'm always interested in new animals, and new animals are being discovered around the world. It seems like, for instance, last year there were lots more reports of mystery cats than I'd seen in quite a few years. So that certainly gets me scratching my head. We're going to get more reports in that area. So yeah. I just try to be conscious on many different levels.
And do you think in your lifetime, Loren, that you'll ever see a Bigfoot?
Well, I certainly think that within the next 25 years, and I'm always hopeful that I can live into my 90s, so within the next 25 years, that we're going to have a large new ape discovered in Asia. I think that, as opposed to Bigfoot really happening right away, I'm really much more hopeful of a new animal that's like a Bigfoot, like a little ape-like creature being discovered in Sumatra, in Indonesia, in Asia. And so that's where I really have a lot more hope. I think that we're getting lots of indications out of Sumatra that the Orange Pindek will be discovered. And I think that will shake up the field just as much as if a Yeti or a Yeren or a Bigfoot is discovered. And so that's what I'm hoping for first.
Okay, Loren, well, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you can join us back in the future.
Okay, that'd be great.
To find out more on Loren Coleman, go to lorencoleman.com or visit my site, themoreshow.co.uk, and look up Loren Coleman under past guests. Well, until next time, be safe.
Visit themoreshow.co.uk/shop to purchase products and services from your favourite past guests. If you're new to this site, you can also catch up on the previous television and radio shows through YouTube and the More Show website.